Namaste. Hello friends, this is the 5th of April 2025. We are going to start with our session of reading the newspaper. The editorial from the April 4th, 2025, the Indian Express by Shoumitro Chatterjee. He is the writer and an assistant professor of international economics at Hopkins University. The heading is How to Trump Tariffs. In an uncertain trade landscape, global firms will seek predictability and openness. India can be a safe haven. India's priority should be to grow its global market share, regardless of whether global trade itself is expanding or not. To that end, India must aim to improve its competitiveness by reversing current trade policy trends. While the US may be using reciprocal tariffs as a pressure tactic to bring countries to the negotiating table, India should liberalize trade policy not reactively but as a part of a long-term strategy. US President Donald Trump has announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs on all trade partners in addition to the existing tariffs on steel and aluminium. The stated goals: firstly, reshore manufacturing, especially of cars, electronics and chips, and secondly, to reduce the bilateral trade deficits. Whether those aims can be met remains uncertain, but two things are clear. First, this is a seismic shock to the global trade order. The scale of these tariffs is unprecedented, by some estimates greater than those under the infamous Smoot-Hawley legislation. A baseline tariff of 10% applies to all the countries, with higher rates for nations running trade surplus with the US. China, the primary target, faces a 54% tariff hike, 34% newly announced on the top of the existing 20%. Surprisingly, even close US allies like the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and the Vietnam have not been spared. Despite the fact that the US has free trade agreement FTAs with the latter three, these partners will face tariffs of 20% or more justified by the US on grounds of alleged currency manipulation and non-tariff barriers. The tariffs are broad and indiscriminate, applied across products rather than sector-specific lines. This new regime will likely shrink global trade opportunities at substantial cost, and price increases dampen demand. This new regime will likely shrink global trade opportunities as substantial cost and price increases. As substantial cost and price increases dampen demand. Secondly, we now face deep trade policy uncertainty. The announcement lacked clarity on key details. For instance, the US has cited implied production levels that far exceed applied MFN, most favored nation rates. India's MFN rate is 17%, but the US claims India's overall protection is 52% due to non-tariff barriers. Moreover, it's unclear if the tariffs are dynamic. If India reduces its own tariffs, will the US reciprocate? Finally, retaliatory measures by the other countries would spiral into a full-blown trade war or set in motion a protracted process of negotiation and bargaining, leaving the trade regime fundamentally unstable. Decision-making for firms and governments will be extremely difficult. All that said, India may have gained a window of opportunity. India's relative advantage stems from the fact that the reciprocal tariffs it faces are lower than those imposed on many of its competitors. Consider two sectors: low-skilled goods like apparel and footwear, and high-tech products like the electronics. Start with apparel. These are not products the US is likely to reshore because American wages are too high to be globally competitive. India has an edge. Tariffs on export to the US will be 27% for India compared to the 54% for China, 46% for Vietnam, 37% for Bangladesh, and 32% for Indonesia. As long as the US continues to import apparel, Indian exporters will experience a competitive advantage. This will be true for other unskilled labor-intensive exports as well. In electronics, the picture is more nuanced. The US aims to reshore this sector and the political will to do so is strong, but India is still well positioned. Among key exporters, Vietnam, Thailand, and Taiwan all face higher tariffs than India. Japan and South Korea are the exceptions, with marginally lower tariffs of 24% and 26% respectively. While some firms may relocate to the US, the current uncertainty makes fully reshoring production risky. Apple, for instance, benefits from manufacturing in India, which allows it to serve global markets more efficiently and avoid punitive tariffs elsewhere. To be sure, countries in Latin America and Turkey face the lowest 10% baseline tariff, but among large Asian exporters, which are the closest competitors, India has clearly fared better. For now, pharmaceuticals have been exempted, adding to India's advantage. In short, despite a murky policy environment and likely weaker global export demand, this is a boost to China plus one, Vietnam plus one, and Bangladesh plus one strategies that global firms are pursuing. If one looks closely, the impact of the new tariffs will be to undermine the China-centered global value chain. If one looks closely, the impact of the new tariffs will be to undermine the China-centered global value chain in Asia because the countries hit hardest are the integral part of it. How should India respond? India's priority should be to grow its global market share regardless of whether the global trade itself is expanding or not. To that end, India must aim to improve its competitiveness by reversing current trade policy trends. While the US may be using reciprocal tariffs as a pressure tactic to bring countries to the negotiating table, India should liberalize trade policy not reactively but as a part of long-term strategy. These reform agendas should rest on the three pillars. Firstly, tariffs must be lowered and rationalized. A uniform tariff of 5 to 10% or a two-tiered structure, for example, a 5% on inputs and 10% on the final good, would simplify the system. This would reduce inefficiencies, delays, and rent seeking at the border. Second, eliminate non-tariff barriers like quality control orders that act as disguised protectionism rather than ensuring standards. Combined with lower tariffs, this would help India a low-cost destination for investors. Third and most crucial, ensure policy stability. India must avoid the urge to frequently revise tariffs or impose retrospective duties like those levied on Volkswagen and Samsung for decade-old imports. In today's volatile global environment, stability is a key competitive advantage. The main exception to this liberalization agenda is agriculture, particularly food crops. In the current geopolitical climate, India must maintain domestic production to ensure food security. Trade policy here requires more caution. Still, there is scope to lower tariffs on non-food crops or those not widely consumed in India, such as soybean and maize meant for poultry feed, which are major US exports. Counterintuitive as it may seem, the winners in this uncertain trade landscape will not be those who raise the barrier, but those who offer predictability and openness. Global firms will seek production hubs and export platforms that are cost effective, policy stable, can provide labor and capital at scale, and are insulated from retaliatory action. India can and should be that safe haven. This means resisting protectionism and doubling down on trade reforms. This will not only secure India's place in the shifting supply chains but also send a strong signal to the investors that India is open for business regardless of what other countries do. Thank you.